What's that? I'll get Thank you. I'll get started with some introductions and just some general housekeeping, and then we'll get to our speaker. Welcome to our invasive jumping worms impact and control of a new soil invader. This is our second webinar of in total 4 for Greenshield Week, and we're happy to host Bradley Herrick from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, and we will introduce him in just a little bit. My name is Ryan Anderson. I am the Sustainable Communities Manager for the IPM Institute of North America. We are a nonprofit based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and our mission is to advance sustainability in agriculture and communities through market mechanisms based in integrated pest management. 2 of our initiatives have hosted this session. First is Midwest Grows Green. Second is Greenshield Certified. Midwest Grows Green's mission is to educate and empower citizens to take sustainable landscaping action that reduces harmful runoff into our waterways, protects the health of our most vulnerable citizens, and reduces negative impacts of pesticides on non-target species such as pollinators. We have a lofty vision at Midwest Grows Green, and that is to make all public and private parks, playing fields, and outdoor landscapes in the Midwest organic by the year 2030. It's a lofty vision, but we think we can do it through certain metrics. We're going to identify sustainable landscaping. We're going to, through our Greenshield Certified for Landscapes, we're going to teach sustainable landscaping through our Lawn and Land Forum. And finally, we're going to implement sustainable landscaping through our Technical Assistance Program. And if you want to learn more about each of those programs, please visit midwestgrowsgreen.org. All those programs that I just mentioned would not be possible without the support of our sponsors and funders. I first want to recognize the North Central IPM Center that has allowed us to have these webinars through our Lawn and Land Forum and has supported our Lawn and Land Forum since the start in 2016. We've had many great presenters share about sustainable landscaping, how they will reduce or eliminate pesticide and synthetic fertilizer use on their green spaces. And we upload all that information onto lawnandland.org. So this work is supported by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Crop Protection and Pest Management Program through the NCIPM. And the NCIPM also supports a number of our other working groups and working groups across the North Central region. That includes our school IPM working group and our TIC IPM working group. So if you want to learn a little bit more about those IPM strategies and practices, please either contact myself or Lorelei. Her contact information is in the chat. We also have support from Earthworks Turf. They are a organic-based fertilizer company. They've worked with us on a couple of our projects, our technical assistance program projects to eliminate synthetic pesticide and fertilizer use. And we actually just did a podcast with them yesterday that's probably going to come out around Earth Week, where we talk about our Greenshield Certified for Landscape standards. We also have 2 healthy family sponsors. Techterra Environmental is an organic product company, sells organic pesticides as well as organic fertilizers. And Barry Draycott presented with us for Greenshield Week last evening, and we thank him for that. And then Natural Gardens Natives is a native plant distributor out here in the Midwest, owned by Midwest Ground Covers, and they've been supporters of our Greenshield Certified for Landscapes initiative since its start last year. So we're very appreciative of their support. As I mentioned, we have a couple other Greenshield Week webinars that I just want to run through. First, on Thursday, we're going to keep on insects, or we're going to keep on kind of the insect, worm, and other pest management through our Sustainable Management of Turfgrass Insects webinar. You can register for $10 at bit.ly/sustainablepest23. And our presenter is Dr. Doug Richmond from Purdue University and their Soil Ecology Laboratory. We're going to talk about grubs, billbugs, and a couple other turfgrass insects and pests. And then we are going to have a webinar next week dealing with rodenticides. So the EPA is proposing restrictions on rodenticides. They are proposing to make all second generation rodenticides restricted use. And so we have two speakers for that session next Thursday. First, we have Hardy Kern, who is the pesticide policy director for the American Bird Conservancy, who's going to go through these proposed restrictions, the motivations behind them, and which rodenticides are going to be restricted. And then after him, we're going to have Dr. Bobby Corrigan, who is known as kind of the foremost urban rodentologist across the United States, talk about how pest control operators can respond to these new restrictions. So this is a very exciting and timely webinar that we highly encourage, especially if you're in the pest control industry, to attend, and you can register for that at bit.ly/EPA rodenticides. For all these sessions that we have for the remainder of this week, as well as next week, they are acceptable for continuing education units in a number of states. This session in particular is acceptable for Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. If you are in those states and need your pesticide certification credit units, please email Lorelei D. Huvetter at ldhuybettr@ipminstitute.org. And you should email her all this information, and I'll have this slide up at the end of Bradley's presentation. Just want to go through the objectives of why we're having these webinars. And really why we're having these webinars is to provide you, the landscape manager with the tools to implement sustainable landscaping and achieve our new Greenshield certified for landscape standards. We introduced these standards last year. We believe they are the first sustainable landscaping certification in the United States. You can learn more about this certification at bit.ly/GSC in caps, landscapes and uncaps. And I just want to take some time to congratulate our 3 companies that are piloting this program and have achieved our standards. We have Good Nature Organic Lawn Care, who has branches out in Chicago area, Cleveland, Columbus, as well as Pittsburgh and Indianapolis. And they are a full lawn care service, organic lawn care service. We have Dig Right In Landscaping, which services the west suburbs of greater Chicago, and they do lawn care, but also sustainable landscape design work. And then finally, we have Natural Communities Native Plants, which is a consulting firm for natural areas, but also a distributor of native plants in wholesale. So congratulations to all 3 of these companies for achieving our standards. Just a little overview of what they needed to do. They need to pass our on-site evaluation, which had a number of minimum requirements. Mainly, you're not applying any products that are carcinogenic, are neurotoxic, have endocrine disruptors. And then they need to score 80% or above on our score practices, which are advanced sustainable landscaping, like are you using native plants on most of your fields or most of your designs? Are you doing compost top dressing, fertilizing organically, etc.? They get an interim report with recommendations that they must address, and then a final report once they have achieved all the minimum requirements and our scored practices. And then we offer them marketing in terms of press releases. We just came out with a press release for these companies yesterday. They need to renew their certification every year to make sure their products are compliant with our GSC standards. And then they need to schedule another on-site evaluation every 3 years. So it's a pretty comprehensive program and rigorous program to make sure that they're continuing to excel in sustainable landscaping services. So if you're interested in Greenshield certified for landscapes, please contact myself to either schedule your on-site evaluation or just to talk about the program. All right, that's enough housekeeping for me. And now I do want to get to the presentation. We're very excited to have Bradley Herrick from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum to talk about invasive jumping worms, the impact and control of this new soil invader. I will turn it over to you, Bradley.
All right. Thank you very much, Ryan and Lorelei, for having me on this afternoon. So I'm going to be, once I get my screen pulled up here we go. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about a new soil invader, a new earthworm invader, collectively referred to as jumping worms. And some of you on this webinar may be familiar with them, some may not. So we're going to kind of start off with a background, earthworm, generally biology and ecology. And then of course, spend most of the time talking about jumping worms. What are they? How do we identify them? What's the big deal with them? Why are they concerning? Impact to landscapes, including gardens, but also sort of manicured landscapes, as well as natural forests. How they got here, and then finally we'll wrap up with ways that we can control them sustainably. So to dive right in here, earthworms are ubiquitous. We've all seen an earthworm. They're really simple organisms. They feed on soil and organic matter, often in the form of leaf litter. They are promiscuous organisms, polygamous, hermaphroditic, but some can reproduce what's called parthenogenically. So that's basically, they can reproduce asexually. They don't need a mate to reproduce, having all sexual organs. And so that's what makes this group of earthworms particularly concerning, is that in theory, if you have a mature adult that gets moved to a new area, that could be the beginning of a new population. All right, so earthworms are often categorized into three broad functional or ecological groups within the soil profile. This top group are called epigeic species, and they are primarily litter dwellers. So they're often just on top of the soil, not actually in the soil, but amongst whatever organic matter there is. So in the case of forests, they're going to be in that forest or duff layer. In the case of manicured landscapes, it'd be in like a mulch layer or a compost layer if that's on top of the soil. And there's this intermediate group, the endogeic group, and these are species that spend their time in the topsoil, but don't go very deep. They don't create burrows. They just kind of hang out just below the soil surface. And then you guessed it, there's a third group of subsoil dwellers, the ones that go deep. These are referred to as anesic. And so a common species that we're all familiar with in this group is the common nightcrawler, often used for fishing bait. They can create really deep burrows up to several feet below the surface. And there are intermediate groups in between these. So there are some species that like to span the endogeic and epigeic areas, and we refer to those as epiendogeic, which makes sense. So they will, and that's kind of where jumping worms come in. Jumping worms are epiendogeic. They hang out in the litter, they hang out in the topsoil, but they don't go much deeper than that. So that's where you're going to find jumping worms on your landscape. So in terms of one of our systems, native forests, and this is especially impactful in the Midwest, where we have no native earthworms. So any area of North America that was covered by glaciers during the last ice age, if they had native earthworms, they were exterminated by the action of the glacier. So the ecological communities that evolved post-glaciation did so in the absence of earthworms. So this includes all areas of the upper Midwest, many parts of New England, and most, if not all, of Canada. So any earthworm, whether they're European variety or these new jumping worms, can be detrimental to forest health, where when they move in, They consume this really healthy leaf layer. Again, this is the organic rich layer of forests. And you can see in a healthy forest, there's these really defined stratifications of soil, different soil types. Well, earthworms consume that organic layer right here, which is really important for native plant growth in particular. It holds a lot of nutrients, holds a lot of moisture. But in the absence of that, we see that there are very few native plants that can survive. And the ones that can survive are usually very common species. And there's not a lot of diversity. What's left is just a layer of mineral soil. You see tree roots that become buttressed, where they're sticking out of the ground. Eventually, these trees will succumb to the action of the earthworms. And you see a lot of mixing of soil, which we'll come back to. In certain systems, that's a good thing. In forests, it is not a good thing. So we know this is happening with other earthworm species in northern forests of North America. And we think it's going to happen as well. It's going to actually accelerate with these other earthworms, jumping worms coming onto the scene. Earthworms in general really do a great job actually at changing their environment to fit their needs. They are ecological engineers. You can think of them as kind of keystone species, meaning that when they arrive on the scene, they have the ability to produce cascading effects on soil, on the soil chemistry, on the biological aspects of either a forest or a garden or a landscape. And they do this through just their life cycle, their burrowing activities, their castings, which are the earthworm's excrement, how they feed, and then just through their death and decomposition. I won't go through all these, but you can just see here on the screen the physical, chemical, biological changes that can take place when earthworms enter an environment. So that was the quick and dirty Earthworm 101. And I want to spend time talking about jumping worms. So this is a really new, relatively new, I should say, at this point, invader in North America. They're endemic to parts of Asia. The common ones that we have are from Japan primarily, but also they come from the Korean Peninsula, parts of China. And what's interesting is that in their native habitat, they're commonly found along forest edges and in grasslands. And we have not found them in grassland in North America, to my knowledge. Grasslands in this case meaning like prairies or fields. They can be found in like turf landscapes. There's hundreds of species and affiliated genre worldwide. It's a relatively large group of earthworms. And the three that are most common in North America tend to co-occur. And I'll just run through these names for you. The genus is Amenthis tokyoensis, Amenthis agrestis. And this last one, it used to be called a metaphire. Now it is back with the Amenthis group, Amenthis hilgendorfi. Taxonomists are always messing with us with these names, but these are the three that often co-occur. It's really academic what they're called. They differ by size primarily, but they really are functionally, they do the same thing. They eat the same food and live in the same areas of the soil. And there you go. All three are epiendogic. All three are parthenogenic. So one of the big questions that I get a lot is, there's a lot of earthworms out there. How do I tell the difference between a jumping worm on the left here and maybe any other type of earthworm that I might see in the soil? And so I'm going to run through kind of a comparison list of traits for jumping worms on the left and a common earthworm called the red worm, referred to, the scientific name is Lumbricus rubellus. And these two earthworms tend to be found in the same area of the soil. They're both considered epiendogic. So again, they're in the litter or just below the soil. So you might come across both of them. And so it's good to know which is which. So I'm going to run through this list here somewhat quickly, but try and hit on some of the main points here. So in terms of these two groups, jumping worms tend to be a bit larger in size. Length, however, in ecology and the natural sciences is not really a good trait to tell individuals apart. As I'm sure most of you know, climate, microhabitat characteristics can really be a strong determinant of size for these organisms. And so this is just very general, but there's a lot of overlap as well. But generally, jumping worms will be larger than red worms or a lot of the other worms that you might come across in that part of the soil. One of the biggest differences is their life cycle. Jumping worms are an annual species, which is somewhat unique for an invasive species, especially one that is spreading as fast as jumping worms. So they are in the Midwest. They're getting ready to hatch right about now, if they haven't already started. They're hatching from little cocoons, little eggs in the soil, and then they will continue to grow throughout the growing season. And then right after the first hard freeze, sometime usually in October, depending on the season, all the adult earthworms will die, and their population will be sustained over the winter in those cocoons. So the cocoons are able to survive at least Midwestern, and as far as we know, Southern Canada winters. So it's a very hardy part of their life cycle. All other earthworms are not annual. They can live many, many years. Night crawlers have been known to live dozens of years. And so they have the ability, they also produce cocoons, but they have the ability to burrow below the frost line and survive over winter. The coloration, again, can be somewhat of a vague trait, but generally you can see from this photo that jumping worms are a little bit darker brown color than other earthworms that tend to be more red or reddish brown. And their skin, you'd have to obviously handle one to know this, but they have more of a rigid body type, which I'll explain later, gives them their jumping name. It helps them to be much more active that way, whereas other earthworms, as you know, are kind of wiggly, squirmy, but they're also kind of flaccid. They're not, they don't have a very rigid body type. A big difference between jumping worms and all other earthworms is this structure near their head called the clitullum. And this is kind of the reproductive area of an earthworm. This is where cocoons are produced. And it looks very different on adult earthworms. So jumping worms, and that's what these arrows are pointing to here. I should mention that. These arrows are pointing to the clitullum on both of these individuals. Jumping worms have a milky white coloration to their clitullum. It is annular, meaning that it goes all the way around their body. It's a full ring, and it's smooth. So if you were to run your fingers across the plane of this earthworm, you wouldn't be able to tell where the clitullum started or ended. It's the same plane as the rest of the body, where basically all those characteristics are different on any other species of earthworm. The clitullum is usually the same color, maybe slightly pinker or redder than the body. The structure does not go all the way around the body. It's a saddle shape. So if you were to flip this worm over, you'd see that the two ends do not connect. And it's raised. And you can kind of see that from this photo. So that's when the earthworms are mature. That is the best way to tell them apart. If you're able to get get a hold of them, it's very obvious. And if you wanted to get academic with these and kind of nerd out with a microscope, you could count the number of segments from the mouth part to when the clitullum starts. And each species has a different number of segments. Actually, individuals can vary as well, but you could count generally the clitullums all start at the same number of segments given a species. And so that is one way you can tell as well, but that's not necessary if they're mature. You can just see visually that they're different. The behavior is very different. And if you're experienced with jumping worms, if the name it means anything to you, jumping worm, sometimes called snake worms, they can be very active, disturbingly so if you're not used to them. They will thrash around, they will perform like a snake and kind of slither away from you. They will flop around. They don't actually jump. They don't have legs, but their rigid body type allows them to really have a very erratic behavior. Whereas other earthworms, they can be wiggly, but nothing like a jumping worm. And then I mentioned earlier the castings that they create. Again, this is the earthworm's excrement that they produce after eating organic matter. They produce a very distinctive soil structure. And I'll show you a photo of what that looks like, but it's often described as coffee grounds. I've heard it described as taco meat like, which I don't like that one because it kind of ruins tacos for me. But it's a very distinctive layer, and they produce this over, it's a kind of a ubiquitous layer of castings, whereas other earthworms produce little mounds or dispersed casts of different sizes. And then finally on this list, another kind of morphological trait is that when they're handled roughly, jumping worms will drop a segment of their tail. And we don't know why, but it's likely a mechanism to escape predation, similar to what some lizards will do. Other earthworms, as far as we know, don't have this trait. They don't do that. So these are things to kind of look for if you're unsure about what earthworms you might be observing. So in picture form, we can kind of describe some of these traits. This is a photo. This is actually a single photo of an Invasive jumping worm invasion on the left, and soil that's been uninvaded, at least at this time. And so hopefully it's clear on the screen here that the jumping worm soil is very granular looking. There's not a lot of organic matter there. And it's ubiquitously granular. Hopefully that comes through there. We're on the right-hand side where the invasion has not come to yet. There are other earthworms here. You can kind of pick out little casts. I'll point to them. Little casts here and there. Here's one. Here's one. They're kind of randomly dispersed wherever the earthworm might be at that time. There's more organic matter, but it looks more of what we would think of as sort of quote unquote normal looking soil. Definitely not as granular as jumping worm worked soil. A couple of videos here and photos now that I'll share that kind of illustrates their behavior. This is a mass of jumping worms that we collected and put together to really kind of exaggerates their behavior because there's so many of them, but it gives you a good idea of what they're like. You see kind of the snaking action. And when they're disturbed, they're almost very violent like. Here's one that shows the snaking action as well. And see if you can see the clitullum on this one, especially at the end. Yep, so the clitullum is right here. So this is the head, clitullum, and the rest of the body. And you can see how it really snakes away from the person that's disturbing it. And hopefully you can see this granularity in the soil. Very granular. This is a woods just off of our main visitor center here at the UW-Madison Arboretum. And then here's a demonstration of what happens when they drop their last few segments of their tail. You can start seeing it now, it's falling off. So pretty creepy. And of course the tail segment keeps wiggling just to increase the creepy factor. One thing to note here is that 2 earthworms have not been created. It's a myth that if you cut an earthworm in half, you get 2 earthworms. This earthworm is still alive, and it could probably still grow and produce cocoons since the clitullum is still intact. It's just dropped part of its body. Okay, so this is another view of their castings. They're very granular, and like I mentioned, these 3 jumping worm species often co-occur. And so And since they're different sizes, so a Menthis tokyoensis is the smallest size, so it happens to be around 3 to 5 inches long. This one, Metafire, what is now again a Menthis silkendorfi, it can be 8 inches, 9 inches long, a pretty big earthworm. And relative to size, they create larger or smaller castings. And so you might see, if you have 2 or more of these, you might see different size casts, but they're still going to be in that granular sort of not mounds of castings, just a granular ubiquitous layer, a layer of castings. So this is a photo of cocoons. So these are what are produced by the earthworm from their clitullum. We don't really have a good handle on how many an individual can produce every year. But we know that once an earthworm becomes mature, which takes around 80 days from hatching, they can, in theory, produce cocoons until the end of the season. These cocoons are very small, around 2 millimeters in diameter. They're brown, just like what soil looks like, and so they're very hard to detect. And researchers, we think that this is the life cycle stage that is the problem in terms of the species being spread around the landscape. It's very hard to locate them. It took me several years to figure out how to isolate them from the soil through a wet sieving process in order to actually do experimentation on them. We'll talk more about controls and best management practices, but this is one of the ways that we think they're spreading, through their cocoon being moved around the landscape inadvertently. And then from those cocoons, they produce baby earthworms. And so this is a new hatchling, around 15 to 20 millimeters, a couple of centimeters in length. The take-home message from this photo is that they are pigmented when they hatch. So there are worms that are called potworms that many of you might be familiar with. They're very common. They're almost translucent. And so they're really small. They're about this size. It's as big as they get, and they're out now. They are very common in soil and pots, and they also have this behavior. Well, they're kind of erratic. They'll move, they'll wag their head, their tail, their body back and forth. And when we first discovered jumping worms, we didn't know what they looked like in the spring. And we thought that they were the potworms that we were seeing were actually jumping worms, because they were everywhere. They were small. They were very erratic. But it turns out that once we reared them from cocoon, we discovered that nope, these are what we were seeing were actually potworms, thankfully, since they're pretty innocuous. And so you don't have to worry about potworms in terms of there might be something else there. They're potworms, and jumping worms look different. So just to wrap this little section up here about earthworms in general and jumping worms, European earthworms have been studied for a long time. We know that their impacts are on litter layer in deciduous forests, loss of native plant diversity, subsequent increases in other exotic species. They tend to facilitate other invasive species. They change cell nutrient dynamics. We think jumping worms will have very similar impacts to forests, as well as other manicured landscapes like gardens, potentially agriculture. And they could be more dramatic because they can spread, what it seems at this point, much faster. They're parthenogenic. Again, they can reproduce quicker, spread faster, and so that's a concern. So some of you might be thinking at this point in my talk is that, for as long as I've been working in this industry, or as, in my backyard gardens, I've always been told that, earthworms are good for your garden and good for agriculture and landscapes and generally. And so, what's the deal? Isn't that true? And the answer, like many things, is yes and no. And So if we do a quick kind of go back to our earthworm 101, gardens, agriculture, generally manicured landscapes that we have often come with compacted soil. Either soil that's brought in or it's been worked and compacted in other ways. And so it's in need of some kind of amendments, whether it's physical, chemical, biological. And so earthworms, some species of earthworms, like common night crawlers, are able to supply that amendment. And so common night crawlers, again, are the deep dwelling earthworms, the anesic species. And so they will burrow down, they'll create these deep tunnels. Those tunnels can be really beneficial for these kind of landscapes, to allow oxygen to move in and out of those areas, water to better infiltrate into those pores to reach the root systems of plants. As we know now, earthworms eat a lot of organic matter in many forms, such as dead leaves, grass clippings, even pulling organic matter out of the soil itself. And what they do is they produce really nutrient-rich castings, and those castings can be helpful to the soil because they are high in phosphorus and calcium, nitrogen, magnesium, often in the available form, that are all really important nutrients for plant growth. And the benefit here is that the earthworms that are producing them, the common night crawler, maybe ones that are endogeeic that will go down a little ways, these European species, are able to mobilize them, move them around the landscape, create the pores, create infiltration possibilities for water, and then move nutrients in and out of the root zone. So that's an ecological benefit. However, if we focus on jumping worms, they are really, while they can have similar negative impacts, they are fundamentally a different organism due to their behavior and where they are spending most of their time. So we mentioned already that jumping worms, they live under the leaf litter, maybe in the top 5 centimeters of soil. And so they are not effective at aerating the soil at all, except for maybe the top centimeter or two. And so they are not going to be helpful in a garden system where they're not creating those burrows for infiltration or for oxygen exchange. And in fact, they can be detrimental in that they create too much pore space in the top soil, effectively drying it out because it's not able to hold water. And they create really loose topsoil. Those castings are really erodible. So if you're working on any sort of slope, you get a heavy rain, and all that soil, the nutrients, can be eroded off into a nearby water body, which has its own consequences. Soil itself, just the physical properties of those porous soil, that porous soil layer, can be really hard to work with for gardeners or land managers, landscapers that want to plant native plants or other plants into that system. We have a really hard time in some of our areas here at the Arboretum in our native plant garden. We're not able to establish new plants because there's nothing to hold the roots in the top several centimeters. And so they fundamentally change the structure of soil. And they can turn nutrients over really fast, like a quick release fertilizer, where they're creating these nutrient rich castings. But really they're creating them at the end of the season when these jumping worms are at high abundance. They've been growing all year, and now they're mature. They're eating a lot more, and they're producing a lot more nutrients in those casting layers. But they're not actually available. They're not being redistributed into the soil, and even if they were, they're actually not available to the plants because in the fall or late summer, a lot of our native plants are senescing, right? They're not putting resources into the above ground stock. They're putting resources into their roots over winter. And so they're not looking for those nutrients at that time of year. And so there's a mismatch here in what happens in terms of nutrient creation. And we know that at high abundance, these earthworms, jumping worms, can destroy turfgrass, often through direct consumption of the fine roots that some of the turfgrass has, the fine shallow roots. Okay, so the next thing to figure out is how are they being spread around the landscape, right? And we don't have all the answers to this, but we know generally that they are correlated with organic matter. And so this can be in the form of compost, of mulch of many types. Wood mulch tends to be one that they're found a lot in. And again, either it's the worms themselves that are picked up and moved, or it's their cocoons. Things like leaf pickup in the fall, where some municipalities will come around neighborhoods, collect leaves, bring them back to a central location, compost them, and then either sell or redistribute for municipal projects the next year, or make available for residents. And so that's just, it's a way that they could be moved around in the landscape, frankly, very fast. Things like plant sales that are really important, really fun parts of garden clubs, master gardeners, obviously whole industries that sell plants. And these are just ways that many things can spread in the landscape, and jumping worms are one of these. And so and I'll talk about some best management practice here in a moment, but taking precautions to know kind of what to look for, what you're purchasing, making sure that the material is as far as you can, that it's clean, will go a long way, so that these types of sales can go on with using the best available science. So greenhouses, nurseries, just by the nature of their work, could be susceptible to harboring and otherwise moving them around the landscape through sales. And actually, this photo is a good way of minimizing that, having plants up off the ground, so the earthworms cannot crawl into pots. Jumping worms are known to do that, but we'll get to more of those here in a minute. And just the nature of our work, right? We're moving around the landscape. We're either gardening, we're landscaping, we're tending to restoration sites or other land care sites. And we're using tools and mowers and vehicles, and making sure that we are cleaning our tools, which includes our shoes, that we're not moving around invasive species of any sort, whether it's seeds of invasive plants, insect larvae, jumping worm cocoons. And then particular to earthworms, we know they're a favorite of the fishing industry, bait. And that's just one way that they could be spread in the landscape. It's definitely how European species have been spread throughout North America. One way, at least, is through the discarding of unused live bait into the forest or into the water. And so we just encourage folks to throw unused bait into the trash so that they don't have a chance to escape. But these are just ways in general that these kind of organisms are probably moving around the landscape. So we know from research that jumping worms are definitely found in gardens. They're found in turfgrass lawns and forests. To my knowledge, they have not been found in grasslands. And primarily what I mean by grasslands in this context are prairies, whether it's a restored prairie, a native prairie, some kind of warm grass system. And jumping worms are highly correlated with gardens that are treated with some kind of wood mulch. And it doesn't seem to matter what type of wood it is, but we think they travel far and wide in that kind of product. So best management practices here. I'm going to run through these somewhat quickly. So with the Wisconsin DNR and the Wisconsin Green Industry, we created a list of best management practices that are really general, but at least are a start for folks that are working in this industry to be aware of. First of all is, watch for jumping worms and signs of their presence. And, that sort of follows actually from educating yourself and others to recognize what they are. This webinar is a great start on that. So just knowing what you're looking for, what the traits are, what the causes are is really helpful. And then, when possible, only use, sell, plant, purchase, or trade landscaping, garden materials, and plants that appear to be free of jumping worms. And, there's nothing perfect in terms of what we can do to prevent the introduction or spread of any invasive species, particularly jumping worms. But by having the knowledge to know what to look for, what to ask, we can do our best to minimize their spread. And then when it comes to materials specific to like compost, many states in the country have pretty similar compost regulations in terms of the temperature that the temperature that the piles need to be treated at for a given number of days. And those are designed to kill off harmful bacteria or pathogens. And it's usually around 131 degrees Fahrenheit for a certain number of days. We know through research that temperature is more than enough to kill off not only earthworms, but their cocoons as well. So when you can, sell and purchase that kind of material that, has been treated in that manner. And either it's going to be, say, on the bag that you're buying it, or if you're buying it from a nursery or a garden shop, just ask if what their process is for producing that material. Finally, I already mentioned this. Arrive clean, leave clean when you're working at these sites, especially if you're moving from one site to another. Just make sure that you're not inadvertently spreading something on your tools, equipment, or self. Okay, so getting into sort of control methods and sort of we don't have any silver bullet controls at this point. But there are things that you can do to minimize the spread besides those best management practices. One way, if you're curious about what earthworms you have in an area, or if you know that you have jumping worm, but it's at a very localized scale still, a really easy, non-toxic way of figuring out what you have is to use this mustard extraction technique. And this is sort of the recipe for it on your screen. But you're basically mixing dried mustard powder, just any kind of mustard powder that you buy. I buy wholesale from restaurant suppliers, buy like the 10-pound box, and just mix a third cup with a gallon of water, shake it up really well, pour it over an area, and any earthworm that is in that area, depending on how dry the soil is, will dictate how far it can seep in. But if it's at soil capacity, it should go down at least a foot or more, and any earthworm there will often come to the surface. It acts as a skin irritant. It doesn't kill the earthworm, doesn't kill plants or other soil biota, but you can get a sense by just picking them out of the ground what you have, whether it's jumping worm, other earthworms, and you can also tell how many you have in an area. Again, this is a way that you can physically remove earthworms if you have them in an area, jumping worms, if you have them in an area that you don't want them, like your backyard garden, for instance. And here it's sort of in video form, what that looks like. So we've cleared away an area just to get good soil contact. And then shortly, jumping worms will come. You see one in the upper left, there's one wiggling. And jumping worms react very quickly because, again, they're at the soil surface already. And so it's a very good technique for those kind of earthworms. We know, so I mentioned already that temperature heat will definitely affect earthworms. And I mentioned that the composters are already many times required, commercial composters, to heat their compost piles above what is necessary to kill cocoons, which is great. But generally heat in any form, fire, steam treatment, for instance, is a really good potential way of controlling earthworms. And I say potential because if it's at a large scale, it might not be as good, but if it's at a small scale, it's a very sustainable way of treating just the top couple inches or centimeters of the soil that will kill not only the jumping worm, but their cocoons as well. And there's different ways of applying this that I'll talk here in a moment, but so besides heat, there are some other things on the market right now that are research-based. There's one called Botanaguard, which is a commercial entomopathogenic fungal isolate of a naturally occurring fungus called Beauveria bassiana. This fungus actually, like I said, it's naturally occurring. It's a global species of fungus that attacks all sorts of invertebrates and kind of maintains populations that way. This group looked at the isolated form of this and found that it resulted in a pretty good mortality of jumping worms in just 4 weeks. Used just as the Botanaguard product itself had slightly less efficacy, but it was still pretty good. 60% mortality in about 4 weeks as well. So this is available online. It's available at garden stores, and used per label is a good way of treating your soil for a variety of pests. And it's obviously organic. Other mechanisms that we've been testing, nothing has been a silver bullet yet, but there was for a while a product called earlybird, which is an organic fertilizer, the low nitrogen fertilizer that uses what are called saponins, which are natural plant defense chemicals, basically using the byproduct of, for this one, using the byproduct of a Chinese tea seed tree. And the tree is used to produce cooking oil. The byproduct was high concentrated in these saponins. And so this company added these saponins to a low-end fertilizer. And it was used actually for golf courses, honestly, to add nitrogen, but also get rid of earthworms that made the course bumpy. This product is no longer available. The company discontinued it, but there are other options. There's one called Castaway, and some others being developed that are very similar, that are using these natural defense chemicals that are pretty effective, especially direct contact on earthworms. They take care of them very quickly. Some things like soap, biochar have, I think, mixed results. The soap tends to be somewhat harsh on some of the plant roots, and so we haven't seen widespread use of that. And biochar just doesn't have a lot of research behind it, but it's already an amendment that folks use, so we wanted to look at it. So there's more research happening right now. I know that the ginseng industry in Wisconsin is interested in using some byproducts of their ginseng manufacturing to potentially create a jumping worm control. And so that is a potential coming down the market as well. So to wrap this up quickly here, if we talk about back to sort of how we maintain our gardens and landscape with wood mulch, this is one that is sort of, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Like, you need wood mulch, or mulch in general is really important for the health of our gardens, our manicured landscapes. It retains moisture. Weeds, it's good for weed suppression, but it's also food for jumping worms. I mean, that is it's like a buffet for them. So just know that if you're adding mulch, you might have to add a lot of it, like multiple times in a season if you have a bad infestation of jumping worms. So one alternative is first to, if you don't have jumping worms, to keep purchasing your mulch from the supplier that you have been. Just ask questions about the mulch if you're buying from a new source, making sure that it's produced in a way that is unlikely to have jumping worms. It's been, nurseries, contractors have been great to work with. They know that folks want to know about jumping worms and to be sure that they're buying, uninfested products. Also experiment with other types of mulch. Some places are selling like native grass mulch, like big blue stem, Indian grass mulch, things like hay or pine needles that have a different carbon nitrogen ratio, basically more carbon than nitrogen, and it's not as palatable to earthworms, doesn't break down as fast, but may have the same benefits that you're looking for. That's an option. And then again, experiment with different heat applications. I have a lot of folks that are trying solarization in the spring. So putting down either black or often clear plastic is even better because it creates a really strong greenhouse effect. Put that over your soil in the spring before plants come up. It doesn't hurt the roots of the plants, but it might be enough to kill the cocoons before they hatch in the spring. Steam, torching, those are all options depending on your situation. Just to wrap up here, these are some resources that I think Lorelei is going to put in the chat if she hasn't already, of just kind of home garden best management practices that you can look into on your own. So with that, if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take any.
Thank you, Bradley. And please put your questions in the chat while we're waiting for some questions. I do have one question. You mentioned that in Asia, they tend to be in prairies or grasslands, but you haven't seen them established in prairies. Are there any theories of why that is, or has people?
Yeah, that's sort of an unknown at this point. We don't, I'm not sure why, but it's likely there's some difference in their native habitat, what those grasslands look like in terms of plant composition, soil type, maybe the fungal or bacterial associates that we either have, either don't have or do have in those systems that are aren't allowing them to invade in those systems here in North America, or they just aren't as adapted yet to those kind of conditions. Again, at least in North America, that type of organic matter doesn't seem to be as palatable to them, like the native grasses, for example, as opposed to the more nitrogen rich, like maple leaves or basswood leaves that they find in the forest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is there any natural predators of invasive worms?
Yeah, there are. We've always heard the saying that earlybird gets the worm, and that's true. Robins, turkeys, lots of birds will eat earthworms in general. And we know that snakes will eat jumping worms. What's interesting is there was a study that we did a couple of years ago with a student here at UW-Madison that tested if toads would eat them. And they did not like them at all. They consumed European species, but not the jumping worms. And it appeared because jumping worms their behavior is so different, where they thrash around, and it appeared in lab studies that even though they would put them in their mouth, they would drop them and not consume them. And so it's sort of like it's too much work to eat them. And that will have consequences in terms of maybe they're going to build up because they don't have as much predator pressure on them. But that's still very early, and we're doing more research on that.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you do have an infestation of jumping worms and you still obviously want to plant any vegetation. Is there any vegetation that is adjusted to the soil conditions that jumping worms create?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we have some data on that still needs to be looked at in terms of a analysis. We did a survey of about 1,000 gardeners in the US, primarily in the Midwest, but also in New England, kind of asking that exact question, asking for their observation about what plants do you, if you have jumping worm, what plants appear to be surviving okay, what plants maybe are not doing so well. And right now, I mean, a lot of them, things like hostas, for example, things that are really hardy already seem to be doing okay. But I think it might also be sort of how established the plants are. If they're established perennials for many years, their roots are probably going below the root zone that, or below the soil zone that these jumping worms are working in, whereas annual plants or newer plants maybe are not as established and are not going to be able to. But we're actually working on a list of those kinds of plants and trying to identify what are the common traits of these plants that we've been told are okay and plants that don't do as well. Kind of getting to your point about, you know, a list of plants that folks can use if they know they have jumping worms.
Great. And are there any like if individuals find invasive jumping worm infestations, are there any databases or where should they report it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, good question. Yeah, and that's actually a really important part. We really are depending on the public to help us track this invasion at the continental scale. And so there's a lot of great sort of citizen science web-based platforms. One is called EdMaps. That one is actually developed in Georgia, but it's used a lot throughout the country. And there's a jumping worm project on that site. So EdMaps, iNaturalist is another one. And then there's one called IMAP Invasives. These are all, those sites all have jumping worm projects, and you can just go upload your observation. It's great if you have a photo with it, so it can be confirmed. But that's how we know about a lot of these new invasions, and how we build maps is based on the public's involvement in this invasive species spread.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned heat treatment in terms of solarization or as well as steaming and maybe even foaming. This steaming has actually been a new alternative to like herbicide control, non-selective herbicide control. Is there like a certain amount of time that you need to concentrate like the steaming or the foaming to kill the cocoons?
That's a good question. So the only data that we have out there is for compost piles that are just stationary, and they the project that we did looked at a minimum of 3 days for the compost pile. Of course, that's not going to be possible if you're holding a steamer and you're walking around on your yard. It's possible for solarization though. But there's certainly a temperature, and I would guess that a steamer might get there, that it's almost instantaneous. If it's hot enough and you're close to the soil, certainly, firewood, but steaming gets pretty hot, and it wouldn't take 3 days of steam to destroy a cocoon. So solarization is nice because it's, once you set it up, you just let it sit there for, you sit there for a week, and then you know that you've probably reached the temperature that you need to. But with that, there's always caveats, because it would only work the best in like a south facing yard with no canopy, direct sunlight. That's where that's going to be really effective. And I've heard some pretty good things from that. That does work. So it's a promising one.
Do you have any other comments about invasive jumping worm management?
Yeah, I think, right now we know that they've been found in about 38 states in the US and a couple of Canadian provinces. And so they don't move that fast on their own. And so that points to, sort of human mediated spread. And so really, at this point, so if you don't have a silver bullet control, it's really doing what we can to minimize the spread. That's always the best control, and really the most sustainable is just taking a few minutes to check your tools and your boots and just knowing what you're looking for, and that you're not inadvertently spreading cocoons or the worms can really go a long way in slowing the spread of this yet another invader.
Great, thank you. Yeah, looks like that's all the questions that we have about invasive jumping worms. Thank you again, Bradley. I'm just going to share my screen real quickly for the people that are trying to apply for their CEUs. I just want to put that up once more for everybody to email Lorelei if you're in the state of Florida, Indiana, Ohio, or Michigan. You should email her your full name, state of residence, and pesticide applicator's license number. And then just a brief reminder that we have 2 more webinars coming up. The next one is on Thursday, sustainable management of turf grass insects. And then the following Thursday, proposed EPA restrictions on rodenticides, and the registration links are there. So thank you, Bradley, for your time. I really appreciate it. And hope to see everybody else for our upcoming webinars.